suppose just introducing myself. So I began as an audiologist back when I was living out in the East Coast, and then really got interested in research and was trained by some people who helped my transition into understanding research and how it can impact people with hearing loss. And now, as a professor at the University of Minnesota, I have many parts of my job. Part of it is teaching. I teach audiology students, and I teach currently teaching the class on cochlear implants. I do research, which is what I'm going to share with you today primarily. And then I also do service for the university, helping run the audiology training program, helping make sure that we have community connections, things like that. What I want to think about today is how I can. Okay. As you could tell from the title, I'm thinking about listening effort a lot, and I was motivated to think about this several years ago because when I was trained, it was never part of my curriculum. I was never told to ask or even think about the effort a person puts into hearing. And then when I was talking with people, it was something that came up a lot. And as it turns out, it shows up in research and surveys that effort can really be a big part of someone's life. So almost everything we do in the lab right now is trying to better understand effort. And as it turns out, it's something that requires a lot of training that's not intuitive. So in what I'm going to share with you today, it's not just results from the lab, it's also a conversation about how we think about, how we talk about effort with ourselves and with people that are important to us. So tracking patterns of effort in your own life and knowing ways that effort might be invisible, or at least not intuitive for someone, how to explain it to people who are close to you in a way that they can understand how it impacts your life. And then what we've learned from trying to measure this in the lab. Listening effort is actually pretty hard to study because a lot of it is felt, a lot of it is subjective, but we've figured out some ways of studying it that I'm happy to share with you. To back out to the big picture, we know that effort is important, particularly because of what we've learned from surveys showing that people with hearing loss need more time for recovering their energy after they've had a day of work or after they've just engaged in something, that they take more sick leave related to stress. And they say explicitly that I'm exhausted from hearing. We see reduced levels of employment and early retirement among people with hearing loss. And the most important thing, the thing that really motivates why I'm interested in this, is that we see withdrawal from social situations among people with hearing loss. So the idea is that hearing can become so frustrating that you'd just rather not deal with it, right? So that's the problem that I'm trying to deal with. But there's something that makes this very tricky, which is that some people who have hearing loss will not say that it's helpful. And so this is a conundrum. I just told you that there's this big problem, and yet when I was in the clinic or when my current students are in the clinic and they say, tell me about things that are effortful, their patients might say, no, nothing really. And so this is confusing based on what I just said. And so the idea is to think about why this is the case. And to explain why, I'm going to share a little story. This is just a little cartoon. Allow me to indulge. This is a depiction of me when I was living in Seattle many years ago. And the idea was I didn't have a car, so I did all my grocery shopping. I just walked to the store and walked back. And I noticed that even though I loved getting pizza, I wouldn't get pizza because when it fit into my grocery bag, the pizza box was just big enough that it would kind of bang against my knuckles. And it was just enough of an annoyance that I started just not getting it. Not even consciously, just unconsciously, I would just skip past the pizza aisle. And so not having a car didn't just mean I was getting places more slowly. It meant I was eating less pizza, and that's not something I would have predicted. So when we think about why people with hearing loss don't say that a lot of things are effortful, one of the patterns that we notice is that they gradually avoid situations. The way I gradually avoided the pizza because it was kind of annoying and it hit my hand. So this idea of pruning away some things that you would have otherwise bumped on is the idea. So this is, I have found one of the better ways of explaining to someone who doesn't have hearing loss where this pattern comes from. Not everyone, has this pattern, but for some people who do, it's one of those things that happens so slowly that it can be hard for other people to notice. The way it shows up is when you think about like a crowded restaurant, which could be a really hard place to listen. What happens is one person realizes, it's better just to stay home and watch TV. And then the way it shows up is not as someone missing a conversation, missing a word. It shows up as someone not being there, and the rest of the friend group wondering, like, I don't know where that person went. Yeah, he never shows up anymore. So this got me interested in figuring out the ways that hearing related difficulties could show up as behavior rather than show up like on an audiogram. Okay. So some of the ways that people have explained this to me is getting headaches from listening, using paper plates rather than regular plates, because paper plates you can throw away and you don't have to use the energy to wash them, put them in the dishwasher, dry them. Because if you're already tired from listening, you don't want to use extra energy doing that too. The house being a little messier, because again, you don't want to use the energy to pick up all the things. Texting people instead of calling them. Not everyone does this, but my mom, who has hearing loss, she does this a lot sometimes. And just feeling like you want to take a rest after listening. So these are behaviors that unfortunately we don't usually ask about in the clinic. And so I think a lot of this stuff goes unnoticed. And I'm interested in learning from you more of these things so that I can better teach the students who work under me what they should ask about, what they should be aware of. I'm guessing not everyone in this room gets headaches, but maybe some do. Are there other patterns that you feel like you notice that after a hard day of listening, a hard hour of listening, how it shows up in your lives, in your feeling?
Bed early.
Going to bed early. Yeah, that makes sense.
Sometimes if you have a really long day and a lot of meetings, you're tired by 8, 9 o'clock, and
Yeah.
I'd say really enjoying the silence after being with a crowd in a restaurant or something.
Yeah.
And then coming home and it's nice and quiet.
Yeah, enjoying silence, right? Which is not intuitive for a lot of people. Silence has never been so good as after a crowded meeting. Yeah. What do you think?
I'm not gonna do that again.
Oh, yeah. Right. And that's what I'm talking about. The idea of, that was so hard. I would rather avoid that next time. Right. And that gets into what I want to talk about. So the idea of avoidance can be protective, right? I don't want to wear myself out like that. It has another downside, though, in that the more you avoid, the less stimulation you're getting, the less satisfying interactions you're getting. And this is the thing that we're worried about, right? Although I don't have an easy fix for it, I think noticing the pattern is certainly the first step. Because if you would ask me, what was my favorite pizza? I would have said, oh, I don't really have a favorite. But the real answer was, I just don't buy it, right? And so when I'm training students to work with people who have hearing loss and they ask, what situations are effortful for you? And the person says, well, nothing's really effortful. That the underlying answer might be that I avoid listening, right? So that's a different, right? Things can be easy because you have great hearing, or things can be easy because you just avoid hearing. That's an important distinction to make. So the questions that I have them pose are, if they're talking to someone in the booth, what situations did you once enjoy, but now you avoid, right? Like we're talking about here. What situations are you not willing to participate in? Or how much energy do you need to socialize? So these are things where it's not just asking how much effort is used, it's asking about, what have you now done? because you've noticed that listening is hard. And where I want to get to, which I think the people in this room have a lot to say about, is not just these strategies, but what do other people not understand that people in this room do understand about having hearing loss? And part of this is strategy, but part of it is just, what are the strategies? What are the ways that you talk about this to people in your lives? Or someone that you meet a new friend and you have to sort of explain to them, well, this is how I hear, this is my strategy, this is what works best for me. What comes to mind for you as something that my students, that I should know, that probably isn't intuitive to me?
I think, it's a little easier to explain it to seniors.
Yeah,
Because as we get older, sometimes we decide, okay, I'm not gonna go to the concert that lasts till 11:30 at night. I'm going to go to the afternoon premiere or something, or, I've gone to 2 of these book clubs this week. I'm not gonna go to my other one. It's more like you get to a point where you say, I get tired easily, and as you said earlier, I don't want to put that much energy into this particular situation. Things lose their value based on how much it wears you out.
yeah, I like the way you express that. I think that's a good thing for me to pass on, which is that the value of that situation depends on how much it wears you out, not just how enjoyable it is, right? Yeah.
Strategies that I use. I'm Dennis, by the way, if people don't know me, I haven't been here for a long time. But one of the strategies that I use, and my major problem is tinnitus. And when I go to a meeting, particularly if I've been at that location before, I have an idea of how the sound bounces around the room. And I try and seat myself in a position where I'm able to hear, or at least be facing where the conversation is coming from, or whatever like that. So I kind of try and pre-plan it a little bit.
Yeah.
And I'm very active in stroke recovery, and we have regular meetings several places around the Twin Cities. And I try and get there early enough that I can pick the location that's going to best facilitate my being able to understand. A lot of that is being able to see the people. And so that's kind of the strategy that I use. I kind of try and pre-plan.
Yeah. Thanks for telling me about that. I feel like one of the things that a person with perfectly healthy, normal hearing never has to think about is where they're going to sit, right? Imagine the overhead, the extra work it takes to have to get there early and to plan ahead and look around the room and maybe sit in different parts of the room and think, whoa, how's the sound? And that's just extra work that you're doing that some of my students aren't having to do. And that's something that wouldn't even come to mind. So that's a great example of this. Thanks for explaining it.
How long does tea time last? And the reason I say that is because my wife is famous for saying that, I went out with Lisa and we talked for hours, and as we talk, we unwind. And I'm like, how the hell does that work? As I talk, I get more. Can't stop because I'm putting so much effort into it. And I think you kind of watch those subtle little differences. How long does that socialization last, like tea time or going out for coffee or something?
Yeah.
And as you see people start shortening it, they're probably dealing with that,
Yeah, there's something I learned very recently. So in 1 month ago, there's an annual conference of audiology research that happens in Arizona. And so I went out there and my lab went out there. There was a talk about fatigue and hearing loss. And what they did was, they would they would ping a little message to your phone just randomly throughout the day and just say, like, how, what are you doing? How tiring is it? A few other questions, right? And what they found was people would report being more fatigued after short conversations. And I thought, well, that doesn't make sense. How did I? And then, the guy, this is a person presenting who's at Vanderbilt, and he said, the reason it's the direction of the effect is in reverse, because if you're more fatigued, you cut the conversation short, right? You want to cut tea time short. And so it was showing that people, when given control, they can try to shape the conversation, shape the room in the way that accommodates their experience. And what I was presenting there, and what I'll present to you today, is actually research that involves cochlear implants. Now, even though everything I'm doing in my lab right now involves cochlear implants, what we're learning is pretty generalizable to anyone who has hearing loss, I think, for the most part. This work has been funded by grants from the NIH. You probably have heard about the NIH in the news recently. There's a lot going on. So without that institute, none of this could have happened, and the research would have been stalled and probably never would have happened. So I wanted to explain just really briefly how a cochlear implant works to process sound, because it helps us understand where that effort might come from. So when there's sound out in the world, we have a little sound wave up there. The microphone will pick it up, and the first thing it does for the part that you see on the ear is it analyzes the sound and breaks it into its different parts, right? So it's sort of like if you see a score of music, you see the different notes, right? It's not just one thing. You see all the notes of the chord, and the internal device will separate everything out into all those notes. And what it does is, for each of those pitches, it will track how the loudness changes moment to moment. But it doesn't actually deliver the sound inside the ear. It gives instructions for electrical pulses. So there's no sound going in, it's just direct electricity, which is ultimately how the nerves work. And then those instructions get sent back into the piece you see more on the side of the head, which is, pretty small. And then what this does is communicate to the other part that lives inside the head. And the pieces get gradually smaller and smaller and smaller. So where the instructions are sent to is this really tiny bit, which is smaller than a dime. And what that does is it sits in the spiral shape of the cochlea, the hearing organ. And each one of those different frequencies should correspond to a different place on that spiral. It's arranged sort of the way a piano is arranged, with low notes down here and high notes up there. They're all ordered, which is something we take advantage of. So if there was a really high pitch note that the microphone heard, well, it's going to activate this part. And if it's a low pitch, it's going to activate that part. It takes advantage of that. So that goes into the cochlea. Each one of those electrodes will deliver that pulse. And, the tricky part is that, it's such a tiny area that if you try to stimulate one piece, one frequency, you end up stimulating a lot of nearby frequencies. So there's a little bit of loss of clarity. The timing can be good, but the clarity of the signal can be a little blurry. And so there are some things that we can predict from this. I don't expect everyone in here to be a scientist who works with sound waves, but one of the things I'll highlight here is that the sound wave on the left has a slower rate of repetition than the one on the right, which faster. But the way a cochlear implant handles this is that it might lose that difference, right? It knows that they have this general shape, but all those tiny details and the speed of those details can be lost, right? When we convert this into an electrical signal, they can sound the same. And so this actually helps us hear the pitch of the sound, right? Helps you hear when I'm emphasizing certain words and de-emphasizing other words, the difference between my voice and your voice, right? These cues that, are really important for understanding who you're talking to and what they're saying. It's sort of like the melody of your voice, right? So I'll give you a practical example here. So let's say you're in the clinic and you're getting a test, and they give you this sentence, and it's Jane gave 3 red cookies, and you report it back. You get all the words right. But there's different ways of saying this sentence, right? And some of those ways are up on the board. So Jane gave 3 red cookies, right? You're emphasizing, you're conveying something underneath the words here. 3 red cookies, not 2 red cookies, right? You're conveying something that's more than just the words on the page. So these are all, examples of ways you can get all the words, but not really understand what the talker was trying to convey. So this is something we call prosody, and we use prosody to correct when someone has a misunderstanding, to signal to them that here's the important piece, here's the new piece. We can use prosody to signal to someone that we agree with them or that we don't agree with them. All these interesting ways that we use our voice pitch. And the problem is that when someone goes to an audiology clinic, this ability to hear prosody is never tested. We test if you get the words, that's important, but we never really test if you heard this idea of signaling agreement, signaling novelty, right? This is pretty important. So there's a person who's been working with me for a few years. You see him up on the screen here, Harley, who is an audiologist and is working toward his PhD, who has made his mission to better understand this ability and better understand how to measure and so we can know what to do. Right? So just to give you a rundown here, if I'm trying to emphasize the word 3 in this sentence, primarily you can think of it as like a melody of a pitch contour, but also I make that word 3 a little bit longer than usual, and I make that word 3 a little bit louder than usual. There's lots of ways I signal it. And so what Harley's doing here, let me just jump ahead, is he's giving you the words because we're not interested in just whether you get the words. We're interested in whether you perceive the emphasis on the word. And we're doing this because we know that cochlear implants aren't designed to give you that emphasis, right? That's the key thing here. So if you perceive the word 3, then you would slide this up and, for people who come into the lab, they'll do this experiment and they can give us that answer. Now, here's what we're measuring. We have 2 groups of people. We have people with normal hearing or typical hearing. We have people with cochlear implants. And the first thing I'll show you is how often they slide up on a word, they perceive emphasis on a word when it's not there. So about 2 times out of 5, there's some emphasis there. Whereas people with normal hearing, about 10% of the time. So this is not necessarily going to cause a misunderstanding. I just heard a little bit of emphasis. But the key of this project is, when do they hear the most emphasis on the wrong word, right? When I said Jane gave 3 cookies and you thought Jane gave 3 cookies, right? It's just the wrong information, right? And for people with cochlear implants, this happens about one out of every 5 sentences in this study, whereas it basically never happens for people with normal hearing. And the reason that we care about this is that if we had just asked them, what are the words, they could have gotten them all right, and we would have never known that this can happen. But in a social situation, this can cause kind of an embarrassment. It can cause an awkward situation when you realize that you didn't understand where the talker was going. So this is one of the things that we're trying to better understand. And in the next few months, Harley will be working with Medel, who's one of the companies that makes cochlear implants, and using this approach, or at least we're going to set up so they can use this approach to figure out if their implants can better encode this pitch contour. So it's one of the things we're working on. If we go back to this idea of these sound waves, when 2 sounds happen at the same time, we can see them that they're different on the screen. But when they come into the ear, they aren't like tagged and color coded, right? They both arrive at the same time. And now that I've taken away that color cue for you, it's really easy to see how they can blend together. So when I lose that fine detail, 2 sounds will just essentially become one. And that's a big problem for cochlear implants. So that issue of clarity is what I was talking about before. The way that I normally talk about this is by thinking about a keyboard where you can hit one note at a time, ideally. But if you're not very careful, you'll probably just hit a bunch of notes. And the reason I like this as an analogy is that you can still generally be high or low on the piano, but it's just the specific note is not really the accurate one you're hitting. Okay. And this helps us describe listening with a cochlear implant because there's some blurriness with the sound. So if I had you look at this, it might not be clear exactly what it is, but if I provide you with some context, you can probably guess it's, maybe some kind of tulip, some kind of flower. But if I provide a different context, now you might interpret it totally differently, even though it hasn't changed, right? So the blurriness, what it means is you have to rely more on gathering other information, gathering context, and making an inference, right? Making a more of a guess about what you're hearing. It means that some of the details will be lost and you have to, figure out based on what you think it should have been. And that's the part that we think is the effortful part. All right. So I'll skip ahead. I had a little cutesy thing in here about how I can change the blurriness and if, you can maybe not pick up on the fact that it's misspelled on the side, but that's not important. And what we know is that different people with different hearing losses, different cochlear implants, have different experiences of this blurriness, right? So the one way I can illustrate this with the blur, but maybe for other people, it's more like the other image. So there's a lot of different ways that people can hear. And so this is something that we want to understand as it can impact your hearing. So let me zoom back out to the clinical situation. The way I think about audiology, not to be too pessimistic, but it's kind of like looking through a keyhole at someone's ability. When we test beeps and how loud is this and how many words you get, these are important things, right? These are foundational. But what I've been more interested in recent years are more complicated things, like when you have to fill in a word that you missed, if you're thinking about the last thing you heard because you're trying to figure it out, right? And as you're doing that, maybe you're not quite ready for the next sentence and the person keeps talking. And maybe, in a conversation, you're not just repeating back what you heard, you're coming up with something new, right? You're exchanging. Thinking about whether you want someone to repeat themselves or am I just going to go with the flow and hope that I catch up? Like that process, that decision-making process is very interesting to me. And all of this essentially builds up to, is this conversation worth my effort? Right? These are questions that we're trying to better understand at the lab. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to share with you ways that we've measured effort. Maybe you'll learn something, maybe you'll help me learn something. There are a lot of ways of measuring effort. You can just ask someone, but we don't tend to do that because speech is very fast. There are a lot of events that happen quickly, and it's really hard for someone to keep track and go back and say, well, when I heard this word, it gets lost. And effort can happen at different moments. And so we tend to use other kinds of measurements, reaction times, or measuring something that the brain is doing. You can measure cortisol levels, which are essentially a sign of stress as you're listening. You can measure variability in the person's heart rate. And also, if you get nervous and your hands kind of get, you can measure that, right? And so we can measure that as a sign of nervousness as someone's listening. What we've been doing more in the lab is measuring changes in a person's pupil dilation, right? So this is very good because pupil dilation happens very rapidly, just as speech happens very rapidly. And pupil dilation doesn't have any electrical components. So even if a person uses a hearing aid or uses a cochlear implant, we can make this measurement very easily, which is very good. The device won't interfere with it, right? So here's how we do it. Person who comes in the lab will sit in front of this computer screen. It's mostly blank. And a beep happens. That means they're going to hear a sentence. And then 2 seconds after the sentence, we tell them repeat back what they heard. That's generally how it works. There's different variations on this, but this is generally how it works. And the whole time as they're listening, we're tracking changes in their pupil size. and seeing if the pupil is dilating faster or more. Does it happen earlier or later? There's lots of things we can measure this. And the way we measure it, we plot it along this time course. We can see our different landmarks there. And the 0 line means that the pupils remain the same size. But as you listen to a sentence, the pupil will grow a little bit. And as soon as the sentence is over, it returns back because you figure out what you heard. And then it goes up again as you're talking, right? So now that we've understood this, we can do some comparisons. If I give you my speech, if I'm trying to talk really clearly, then maybe we'll get this. And then if I bring in someone else who's not taking as much care to talk very clearly, and we see more growth in your pupil size, that's indicating that it was harder for you to listen to that person. And there's different, features that we'd look at here. So this happens over the course of just a few seconds. So it's not something we use to understand a full day worth of effort. It's understanding how you understand words and sentences and those moments when you missed one thing and you're trying to catch up to it. I'm interested in that moment. So I'll give you the story first, and then I'll show you the data that we use to build that story. One thing that will not come as a surprise is that speaking more slowly can reduce effort. But we've found that the reason it reduces effort is because it allows you to use the context within the sentence to piece things together, not just to hear each individual word, but to help put them together coherently. We've learned that the effort a person exerts to understand speech is totally separate from the percent correct they get on the test. And this was something that was the assumption before our work in the lab, is that you could just guess how much effort someone put in by looking at how low or high their score was. We've learned that, I think this is a really important thing, that effort lasts longer than you're actually listening because you're thinking about what you heard, right? That's an important piece, because what it means is that it can carry over and stop you from hearing the next thing that the person said. So this is, as I said, this probably won't come as a surprise to people in this room, but it was actually pretty difficult to measure in a way that can convince people, because I can't just say, well, Michael told me this happened, so it happened. I have to provide data. I have to provide an experiment that shows this. So the situation that we've been trying to study is this. You've probably heard this before. If there's a word that you missed, but you can kind of figure out what the word is, and this might happen in everyday life as well. And the difference here, the reason I think this is so important, is that when it happens in everyday life, right, when you figure out in your head what the person said, that person might be on to the next sentence, and you might have missed that next sentence. And so this is not something we really measure in the clinic, because we just give you one thing at a time, right? And conversations happen, they just flow. So this process can be invisible, right? As you're doing it, the person you're talking to might not realize you're doing it. And then they just keep going, and it's too hard to listen to this. So this is what we really want to understand. And the way we had to do it, we couldn't just play sentences. We had to know that this was going on in someone's head. And here's how we did that. We have sentences that are normal. You can see that there's this particular word there where if I take that word out, you could still figure out what it is by going backwards, right? And so we designed a lot of these sentences where the context you would use goes backwards in time. It's not anticipation, it's like repairing something, right? So lots of these sentences. So the idea is, if I compare your effort for listening to the top sentence versus the second sentence, then I would get a sense of how effortful it is to go back and repair that word, right? So that's what we did. If you're repairing that word, effort should happen right after. That's the idea. So let me show you what this looks like. So if I play a regular sentence, this is the change in pupil size. We can see where the sentence was and where your response was. And the crucial thing is what happens when I force you to go back and repair that word. And we see that it elicits greater pupil size. And there's a couple details I want to point out here. One is that even when you get the whole sentence correct, when you've correctly repaired it, the results look exactly the same, right? That's I put in the dashed line. The other thing, right? The other thing is that we can see where this change happened. See, I can use my cursor here. It's way after the sentence has been over. Right. So that repair process, you're still thinking about it. You've got it right, but you're like, was it really that word? I'm not really sure. I think it was. And that process continues in your mind. So that's where we're eventually going to go here. We've learned that slower speaking rate allows you to better do this because that repair and recovery time, if we slow down the sentence or if I extend that out a little bit, you're actually more ready to hear the next thing, right? The other thing we've learned about this is that the timing of that repair process really matters. So I'll explain what I mean by this. If I give you this kind of sentence, right? I've highlighted these words because if you make a mistake on the word sand, right, it's different than if you make a mistake on the word beach. Now, we've learned this, but in the clinic and in most other labs, they both count the same. It's just one off, right? But there's actually a different impact. If you make a mistake, well, let me show you what I mean. If you get the sentence correct, we have this change in pupil size, and now we've understood that the higher this gets, the harder that experience is. When you make a mistake on the last word, it's harder because you gotta fill it in. But if you make a mistake on one of the first words in the sentence, oh man, are you in trouble? Right? So we've learned a lot from this by going in and analyzing what exactly is going on. Don't just tally things. Don't just keep track of how many words someone got, but keep track of what they had to do in their head. Right? And again, I'll highlight here. That's not really showing up much on the screen, but oops, that's all right. That most of that big effect we saw was after the sentence was over. So now we get into this idea, well, maybe you're going to miss the next thing. And this is that problem we saw at the kitchen table, right? And here's how we measured this. So we had this sentence and we followed it up, not with a whole other sentence, because that can get really complicated. It's hard to remember two whole sentences. We followed it up with something pretty easy, just 3 numbers. And we know that numbers are really, well, among all the things we can test, they're probably the easiest thing a person can repeat back. So if you made a mistake on the numbers, we knew you must have been trying really hard on that sentence. That's the logic behind this. So here's what we did. We tracked the number of mistakes a person made following, here's our, yeah, so higher again is no good. Following a regular sentence, everyone makes some mistakes, it happens. But when they had to repair that word in the previous sentence, we saw more mistakes on those numbers. And again, those numbers are pretty easy. You'll get 100% on those. So that effort from that previous sentence carried forward, right? Blocked the next thing that someone would hear. For people with normal hearing, they also make mistakes. But for them, that repair process, we put them through the same experiment. That repair process was quick enough that it didn't block the next thing they would have heard. So this is helping us understand that when we're thinking about a mistake is not just one word. A mistake could be derailing your ability to follow sentence after sentence after sentence. And this is something that's been relatively new, right? So in general, there's our lab and one lab in New York who's been really trying to understand this. And what we want to do is really bring this into a clinic and say, here's something we're really interested in, not just single words, but the continuity, right? The flow. So hopefully in the next year or so, we'll be able to do that. So the next thing I want to share with you is flipping around the perspective. So let's say you've heard me speak and you miss a word and you're repairing it in your head. The question here is, can I notice when you're having to do that? Can I like read it in your voice or read it on your face? Do I know when there's been a miscommunication? So here's my audiologist here. And so the patient is listening to one of these two situations. One of them is easier. The red one is hard, right? And they are doing the experiment and they give a response. And now what I'm doing is I'm taking a recording of that person's voice, playing it to the audiologist, because this is sort of like being in the booth, right? When you're in the booth and I'm listening to your response, all I have is your voice. And I have to figure out from your voice if you're trying hard. Okay. So we made an experiment out of this because we played the first two. We have these voice recordings and we played them to other people and said, do you think this person with a cochlear implant heard the whole sentence? Or do you think they had to piece it together in their head? Right? And to cut right to the chase, people are not able to do this, even audiologists, right? So we had 150 people, they couldn't do it. Even people who said, yeah, I should be really good at this, people overestimate their own ability. And then we recruited 25 or so actual audiologists who should be good at this, right? This is their job. Even they couldn't do it. So what this means is effort can be really difficult to detect from the outside. People are good at not giving away signs, which makes sense, right? You wouldn't want to show it on your face, show it in your voice every time. But it means that people have to be more aware of it, right? So let me think about how we are on time.
Oh, you're fine.
We're good, yeah, okay. I like to go through scientific plots piece by piece. The next one I didn't have time to set up, but I'll jump right to the main point. This graph up top, the colorful one, the right side shows there's a certain amount of effort when performance is really good. As we go to the center of the plot, performance starts to get lower. People start to perform around 70%, 50%, and we see a big increase in effort. That's normal. We should expect that. But then as we continue going to the left, right, the brighter colors here, the performance is getting even worse, 30%, 20%, 10%. And we don't see the effort going higher. We see it going lower. And what we've learned from this was a study done several years ago. What we've learned from this is that when you realize you're probably not going to get it, you stop trying to get it. Right? This was only in the lab, so it's not like it's a conversation with a loved one where you might try push a little bit harder. But it's letting us know that there's this turning point that everyone has. Once something gets hard enough, you realize, you know what, let me just pull back. And I think one of the things we'd really like to understand better in the lab and in the clinic is how a person determines that turning point, right? When do you decide, you know what, it's not worth it? And when do you decide I'm going to push harder? That's an important thing, right? So that's one of the things we don't know about yet, how moments build into the fatigue we experience. When effort is worth it, when it's satisfying versus when it's just frustrating, right? And the way I can describe this is, one of my favorite things to do is to play hockey. I'm in Minnesota. So when I play hockey, I put a lot of energy into it. But I'm not complaining about the energy. It's really satisfying, right? But other things, if I'm like carrying a couch up the stairs, that's not satisfying. It could be the same amount of energy, but I'm not getting any enjoyment of that. So we can't just measure how much energy is used. We got to measure how satisfying it is, right? And I think that audiology as a profession hasn't quite gotten there yet. I want to know, as I was just saying, factors that might cause someone to give up and say, you know what, I'll catch up with this person later. And where I started, the idea that hearing loss can cause frustration, can cause someone to withdraw, whether this is really the factor that explains why hearing loss has been found to be related to cognitive decline. Among all the factors that contribute to cognitive decline, hearing loss is the number one risk factor. So this is important stuff, right? And we think that we understand this causal chain, but it's really hard to establish that. So we're still in the theory stage. I'm going to share with you one more piece of new research before I wrap up my time here. And to do so, what I want to do is just make it a little analogy to streetlights. It might not seem intuitive, but indulge me here. Some time ago, we made, several changes to how streetlights work, right? One of the simple changes was just aiming them down so that they're only illuminating the street and not the sky where we don't need it. But the big change was changing to LED light bulbs. And the reason this was a big change is that regular incandescent light bulbs have most of their energy outside of the range that we can actually see with our eyes. So all that energy was wasted. It was just given off as heat. So once we realized, well, if we design a light bulb where the energy is only in the bandwidth we can see with our eyes, we're saving an incredible amount of energy, right? And so I took this and I thought, well, I wonder if this same principle applies to listening. Can we aim our listening effort only where we need it, or are we sort of spreading it everywhere, even where we don't need it? So I'll walk you through how we are trying to understand this, because I think this is, for me, this is the new foundation of how I'm thinking about listening. So the task is to give you an opportunity to reduce effort because it's not going to be as valuable, and also an opportunity to aim effort exactly where you need it. That's the idea. So in this task, you hear two sentences, not just one. But the sentence is always just repeated. It's a repetition of itself. So if I play a sentence and then play it again right away, you shouldn't really be putting a lot of effort into that because you just heard it. So that's what we expect. But if the first time you heard the sentence, one of those words was missing again, right? Likely you want to listen to that again and just target that one word that you missed. That's the key here. And if I make that missing word later in the sentence, you should aim your effort later as well, just to be consistent. So the idea here is that in the second half, you're always just getting a full sentence. So no matter what situation I put you in, the second half of the listening process is always exactly the same. But what you want to do with it depends on what your needs are. In the top case, you don't really need anything. And in the second and third cases, you need something early or need something late. So I'm giving you an opportunity to either dial down or dial up early or dial up late, even though the listening process is exactly the same. And so I'll show you what we've learned so far. So for people with normal hearing, so we've brought in people who are generally older than 50 years old. We're measuring, again, changes in their pupil size as they're listening. And I won't show the data right here. I can show you later if you want. But I'll just show you the interpretation here. What they're doing is when I just give them a straight up repetition, they're dialing down, which is what we thought they would do. And when they need to listen to that second word, or that pupil lights up right at that second word. When they have to hear only the fourth word, the pupil lights up at that fourth word, right? So they're aiming effort where they need at that key information. Are people who come into the lab who use cochlear implants. Generally, they've been living for maybe decades with hearing loss. So their strategy for listening is a little bit different, okay? Again, same situations I'm putting them in, but what they're doing is actually listening to that whole sentence, not just where the key information is, whether the information is late or early, or whether they actually already heard the sentence, listening to it just as hard the second time. And so this is sort of like aiming effort at everything rather than just what's needed. And so this is helping me, it's helping me reevaluate what I think hearing is, how hearing works when someone has hearing loss. Because after all, you could have heard something, but maybe there's a little bit of uncertainty. Maybe there's a second guessing for some of the people in this study where maybe I need a second chance just to make sure, right? Whereas our folks with normal hearing aren't taking that second chance. They're just confident first. So that's a different kind of experience. That's helping me move past just how effortful is one thing. It's more of the approach. What is my approach to listening? That's what I want to understand. So let me skip back to this is the data of this. So this is my analogy, my final analogy, which is if my students are in their textbooks highlighting everything on every single page, it's not really a sign that they're picking up the important parts, right? If you're highlighting everything, nothing's standing out. and they just get stressed out. So what we're learning is that people with hearing loss, people with cochlear implants can aim their effort where it's needed, but they're also aiming it where it's less needed, right? So this is helping us understand maybe the trouble, the thing that makes listening effortful is that people are being less selective. They're highlighting everything, and that could be very fatiguing. So to wrap up, the things that we're observing and where I think it can go in a practical sense is, mistakes early in a sentence, way more costly than mistakes at the end. So, get someone's attention before you start talking to make sure they don't miss the first few words, right? Easy thing to do. We can't know how much effort someone's putting into it if we just measure the number of words they get, and we're not good at detecting it. So we actually have to think about how people handle their effort, how they avoid situations to avoid effort. We can't just measure the same thing we've been doing for 50 years. And finally, I think this is a really important thing, that people use an extra moment after they've heard something to reprocess it in their head and fill in some missing pieces. So after giving some key information, a person should really pause for a moment, let the person catch up, let the listener catch up, and make sure they're ready to hear the next thing. So I think this is advice that I want to give to audiologists, to students, to anyone really. I think this would probably make communication easier for everyone, not just people with hearing loss. And I'm interested in both your questions about the work, things you want to add, right? Because you all have developed strategies for how communication works best for you, and what you think about what we've been able to learn so far. What do you think?
Matthew, one thought that came to me, do we ever work in going to a speech pathologist when you transfer to getting a cochlear implant as an older adult? Would that ever be part of the conversation?
Yeah, so essentially what the term we have for that is oral rehabilitation, where you get a cochlear implant, or even you get a hearing aid, and what you need is practice with the new device, right? The ear has been used to a certain kind of input, and now the input is totally different. You got to relearn how to manage that and map that sound to what it means. Historically, there's been one barrier to this, which is that rehabilitation, audiologists know a lot about how that should work, but the only people who can bill for that service are speech pathologists, just because of the way the law works. And it's been a problem for a long time. And the people who could change it don't seem to be in a hurry to change it. So it takes a little bit of extra collaboration across multiple departments to make that happen. It's always recommended. So last week I had, so again, I teach this class on cochlear implants, and one of the best things we do is have people who use cochlear implants come in and share their experience, right? So we had a woman come and share her experience, and she said, yeah, for all of those appointments, the evaluation, the pre-surgery, all of this stuff, they kept saying, it's really important to have this practice, to have this rehab. Make sure you do that practice. Make sure you have the rehab. And then when she was activated, she said, well, how about that rehab? They said, oh, no, we don't do that. Sorry, we don't do that. Talk about taking someone by surprise. So I think the solution is for those clinics to make sure that there's here's who you call, here's where you go. Sometimes it's just in an entirely different building or a different wing of the building. But they're actually not allowed to do that, unfortunately. Yeah, it's crazy, right?
That seemed awkward.
Yeah, it really is.
Who prevents, what would you say they're not allowed? That's where does that come from?
Well, there are governing bodies of speech pathology and audiology that define the scope of practice, and who's responsible for doing what. It's way above my pay grade, I assure you. Yeah.
I have a question for you, Matt. My experience, because I've worked with a lot of people with hearing loss over the years, and
not only with cochlear implants, but hearing aids, as well. People will go, oh, I have to do that booth test.
Yeah.
Oh, I have to do that booth test. It's, for a lot of people, it's something they really don't want to do.
Yeah.
Why?
I think there are a lot of reasons why. One of the reasons I think people get frustrated at the booth test is that what they're hearing in the booth isn't the thing they're necessarily struggling with in regular conversation, right? And that's one of the reasons why I really want to think about this, what we're calling the carryover effort, when you hear one thing and it blocks you from hearing the next thing. Because when I've brought this up with people, and I noticed when I was talking about it, some of you were like, right? That's a little bit more satisfying of an experience because you think, oh, finally, the thing I'm struggling with is the thing that's being tested. It doesn't mean we have a solution for it yet, but it means we're at least trying to understand what is the core, what is the issue here. I think that's one of the main things. There are probably a bunch of other reasons, and I, feel free to chime in. Any why the booth test? I mean, you're listening with no facial cues. You're listening to sentences you don't really care about. Every sentence is completely unrelated to the one that came before. There are a lot of things that are not very realistic about it. So that can be frustrating. You think, why am I going down this road when this is the road I'm trying to go down? Yeah. What do you think? What's been frustrating for you?
Well, I think that's exactly so, and I have to share this because I think it's relevant to what you're saying, and my own experience in the moment. This room, there's a lot of ambient sound in this room, so it's difficult to hear. And so the first half of your lecture, I'm listening, but I'm working to hear it. And as you point out, it's becoming tiring because there's so much ambient sound. I have 4 slots on my cochlear implant programs. And long story short, only last week I had the public system added, the software for it, but I forgot about it. So I'm sitting here struggling for no reason. And then I remembered, wait a minute, Bertie just said they got the thing fixed, and I actually have it now. So I moved up to that program and I heard everything perfectly, and my stress level just basically disappeared. Ambient sound is to my way of thinking, and it has always been what's evil. I mean, you sit in the booth and go, yeah, sure, I can hear you now, it's perfect. But when I go out in the real world, as you hear it called so often,
Yeah.
that's where nothing matters anymore. It all falls apart.
Yeah. That's right. That's right.
I do notice now that my audiologist, and I got VA, in St. Cloud, they do a test with his background noise, and I can feel my blood pressure go up.
Yeah.
I mean, you would, if you asked me how stressful is the situation, I'd say, slap a blood pressure machine on me and find out.
Yeah.
Because I can just feel it go up. And it's the same thing, when I click to the loop system, that background noise goes down, my blood pressure goes down.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just, I would often tell people when I was mentoring vets at the St. VA, my implant can hear everything, and I can't understand the thing without there.
Yeah.
And that's usually when I exit stage right.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. When you feel your stress go up, you'd rather just to preserve yourself, you'd rather just not deal with it. Yeah. I hear you.
And can I add to that, then what happens, it becomes a habit.
Yeah.
Over a period, okay, and it becomes a habit, and it becomes part of who you are, so to speak. And then that's what you're stuck with.
It becomes a defense mechanism.
I'm sorry,
It becomes a defense mechanism.
yes,
Yeah.
Yeah. My wife uses a mobility scooter. And when the weather gets a little bit slippery in that, her defense mechanism is stay home because, she knows she's gonna have problems out there. Yeah, I think we all, that it's not unique to hearing loss, but I think because hearing is 24/7 part of our life. I think we use it more often.
Yeah, I like how you're phrasing it there because sometimes if I'm giving this kind of presentation to a group of just other scientists, and most of them have normal hearing, right? And one of the first questions is, well, what if we can get people to not avoid things so much? How can we do that? And I think, well, there's probably a reason why you're developing this habit. If I say, well, why don't we just push them out? And I think you just want to push them out in the world and stress them out more. That doesn't sound very nice, right? And I think what we have to do is not assume that a person with hearing loss has to act more like someone with normal hearing. We have to really understand what's motivating this behavior and how to make it better so that you want to go out, but not